All right, making sure that we are recording, which we are. I believe it's July 9th already. Anybody else?
It sure is.
No, Ed, I'm in denial.
Morning, everybody. People are still filing in, so give a minute or two and we'll kick it off and get started. All right, good morning, everybody. It's 10:01. We'll get started. Call this meeting to order for the ESInet user group meeting on July 9th, 2025. A reminder for everybody to sign in through the link in the chat. Thank you, Jennifer, for providing that and the agenda. We'll get started. I hope everybody had a good 4th and kicking off summer. And we'll get started with CenturyLink and the system performance reports.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it. So this is kind of our network performance slides that are in the tariff. And this first one here is showing just that. It's network performance for the month of June. This is basically where we're just pinging the servers constantly to make sure that the network performance is where we need it to be. Right now, based on the data on the screen, everything falls within the range of the tariff. So we didn't have any issues with network performance for the month of June. The second graph, we're looking more at voice quality. This is the MOS by PSAP. Again, we're looking for nothing to fall below that 4, the line of number 4. So we are within scope as far as voice quality goes for the month. And the second one below that is looking at the MOS by ECMC route. And again, we're looking for this to always be 4 or above. So we didn't have anything fall below that level for Miami or for Denver, which is exactly what we want to see. Packet loss percentage, this again is by the ECMC route. We're looking for numbers that fall between 0.5 or equal to less than or equal to 0.5. Sorry. So on this one, we're looking at the options for, the month of June on packet loss. The next one, I think, is where we'll touch base on this on our issues and project tracker too, because I believe this is the chart that we had May 29th kind of be out of bounds with regards to the tariff. And I do have an update on that. I am happy to report for the month of June. Again, we're looking for less than or equal for 20 milliseconds. This chart is showing microseconds. So everything as far as jitter for June fell back into place. And again, once we touch on the project and issues slides, I do have some updates and comments on the May 29th disruption here. And I think that is the last one, Stephen.
All right, any questions on this report for Tracy? All right, hearing nothing. Next item on the agenda is the tracker sheet.
Okay. I updated most of these this morning, late last night, actually. So if we have any questions, I'll go ahead and take notes, but this is as of the information I had last night. We have been talking about 911 transfer capabilities for a long time. I think this was a wish list item before I joined the team. So I do have a meeting tomorrow afternoon with the technicians for the state of Colorado. This would be our 911 technicians, as well as Nebraska. There are a few things that need to be built in the call handling equipment that borders the state of Nebraska. So it's going to be limited to just Nebraska and Colorado for right now. Once we get those changes built, Intrado will help us as well. And we are hoping to have this ability ready by the end of August for Colorado and Nebraska PSAPs that border that state line. So no real action for anyone on this call other than it's moving forward. And I have been told that the next one we're looking at is New Mexico, and that will be working with Motorola. So I'm hoping that that one actually takes place before the end of the year, and we'll just continue to move forward. As far as the statewide ETATS rollout, we're still working on that. We have 13, I think, PSAPs that are still left. We had a good conversation yesterday with Logan County, and I think we're going to start conversations up with them again to get ETATS made available. I think that would be the Sterling location, but still continuing to work on that as you guys are ready. If any of you are not on ETATS and would like to be, I'm happy to set up some time with you and let you know what we need. Basically just IP information, and then we can get everything sent out to you, get training done, and get you up and going. network performance projects. I want to double check. I think Jeff Winkleman is on as well. This is our statewide upgrade effort to move you guys to Ethernet or IPVPN circuits. We have started that. Thank you everyone for helping us get 2 contacts per PSAP. That was retired before we could enter orders. So I appreciate all of the PSAPs working with Sharon to get that information over to us. We have got these orders entered. We are starting to see notifications go out to local PSAPs as far as the dates that we feel the circuits will be delivered, and kind of just giving you an update on what's up and coming. I know there have been some questions. I will agree these templates aren't crystal clear as to what we're looking for. And I'll let Jeff pop in here. It's primarily just a notification that, hey, Mr. PSAP, your order's been placed and this is when we think your circuit will be ready. But I know it's causing some confusion, so I didn't know if Jeff wanted to add anything, or if any of the PSAPs had specific questions as to the notifications you're getting.
I am on, Tracy. Thank you. I'm in my car.
Yeah.
In beautiful Denver, by the way. So the notifications that have been going out, like Tracy said, have been a little cryptic, or maybe some people look at it very cryptic. And we apologize for that. That's a system generated message. And I guess the biggest ask here, we do appreciate the primary and secondary contacts, because that was a system requirement to actually enter the orders. But we've had several situations to where those that are involved with the actual assistance of getting the circuits installed were not either the primary or secondary contact. If you could disseminate information to anybody on the IT team, or that might be involved with that, that would be a huge help for us also.
Yeah, and if there are any questions when these come out, if you guys could just use either myself or Sharon Smith to send the questions to. We had a couple that went out to state of Colorado folks versus NG 911 folks. And, you know, that side of the house is completely separate from public safety. And they were very confused as to what we were doing because they weren't aware of it. So Sharon and I would be happy to field any questions that you guys have and make sure that people understand. Because Jeff, there's not an action for the PSAPs, correct? This is just a notification and some dates.
Correct. On this first part of it, yes, that's just the notification that the circuit is going to be installed. The second half of this is when we actually will coordinate the efforts to have technicians come out and migrate over to the new circuits.
Okay. So I guess, Stephen, if it's okay, I'd like to ask if you do have any PSAPs on the phone that have questions about this, because I know I got 3 or 4 in the last week.
Yeah, this is Ryan in Grand Junction. I do.
Okay.
Well, yeah, and I'm sorry I haven't been able to attend these regularly, but I guess I'm a little confused because we actually did have a tech come on site, fire up another circuit, and it wasn't really explained to me what the purpose of that circuit is. It isn't technically connected to anything. They just have the port fired up now, but is that part of this process, or because it just wasn't clear to me based on what you guys are saying? It doesn't sound like the phase of people actually coming on site and doing anything has technically happened yet. So I was just a little confused on what the point to that action was by the Lumen Tech the other day.
This is Jeff. I would say if you were not expecting any other circuits to be installed, then yes, that's going to be part of the project. The best way to find out or verify it, you should have had an email saying that your circuit is going to be installed or has been installed, and to be able to confirm the order number on that. And like Tracy said, reach out to Tracy and or Sharon with that information and just verify if that's what it's for.
Got it. And what is the point to this circuit? I guess I'm trying to understand what's different about this fiber circuit versus our existing fiber circuits.
It's the way it's being delivered. So it's newer technology. It's IPVPN opposed to a TDMS circuit. So it's going to be an upgraded circuit. It's going to be 10 meg. So it's going to allow for the additional bandwidth requirements that will be coming later as far as video is concerned.
Yeah. Hey, this is
Got
Steve
it.
Alot with Lumen. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, so one of the things that we've done on this network improvement plan is for each site, we've also looked at providing redundancy and diversity. So in the original deployment, what we provided at each of the PSAPs was 2 MPLS circuits that were TDM, and they could have both been Lumen as the last mile provider. So you had redundancy, but not diversity. As part of this plan, this network improvement plan, where it was feasible, we were installing 2 new circuits that were redundant and diverse. So that's the big deal here is, replacing the TDM circuit, the copper circuit with fiber, but more importantly, where it was feasible to also add diversity in there. So you have 2 different last mile providers. So in theory, if something were to happen to the Lumen last mile circuit, you would still be able to process 911 calls because the other non-Lumen last mile provider may not be impacted by that backhaul cut. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Steve, it does to
Okay.
me, so I appreciate that. Yeah,
All
I
right.
mean, at least in Grand Junction's
Yeah.
case, the provider might help, but the physical path I know is exactly the same as far as how it gets to the central office here. But that at least clarifies a little bit of the questions I had. So thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it.
Not
Jennifer's
everybody
got a
is going to
question.
have multiple routes from the PSAP to the central office. So north of the central office, we can do diversity and different paths, it's different technologies.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I want to make sure everybody understands is the whole process and a reason and a logic behind this network improvement plan was to do a couple of things. Number one, to make the network more resilient and more diverse and redundant. So as we are designing these new circuits, as Kevin Newton mentioned, we're looking at all ways possible to minimize single points of failure. So this is a total redesign of the existing network infrastructure to make it truly public safety grade, which is the term we're starting to hear a lot of people in the industry use today.
Jennifer, you have your hand up?
Thanks, Stephen. I think my question's been answered, but just to make sure that we're all clear, it sounds like the EtherNet upgrade and the last mile diversity projects are being done simultaneously where they apply. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Perfect. Thank
Yep.
you.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a follow-up question. So we had a Lumen Tech come to our PSAP last week, did run some tests, wasn't here for very long, but then we had Comcast show up as the contracted provider to be able to run the fiber into our building. Can you confirm that CenturyLink has subbed to Comcast to provide that service for either of those projects?
We
Yeah,
can
so
look
Trace,
it up. Sorry, we work with, our contact is GTT, and they work with the actual circuit providers for the diversity there. And I think, I mean, Lumen doesn't decide, but I think we can tell who the second provider is. Is that correct, Steve or Jeff?
yeah. So let me say this, and this is one thing we probably should do, Tracy, is we do have a list of who the primary and secondary providers are for each of the PSAPs in the state of Colorado that's a part of this network and improvement plan. To minimize some of the confusion, I think we should share that list, but more importantly, before anybody arrives at a customer location, we should provide notification that somebody's coming. Because I think, Steve, what you're saying, people are just showing up and they don't really know. All they know is they got an order in hand to work, but that's the extent of what they know about what's going on.
Yeah, and I guess I'll clarify. We did get a notification by email that
Yeah.
advised us that number one, the first time the Lumen Tech was coming. Number two, we did get a notification that Comcast wanted to come and do an evaluation too for the fiber pole. So that did happen.
Okay,
We didn't respond within 24 hours on that Comcast one, and they did just show up at our door. It all worked out in the end, and it's fine. But just I think that list to this group would be super valuable, because sometimes when those automated notifications come, that there's a ticket and we're provide the service coming into our building, it's not always worded the best. So
okay,
you could
Okay.
provide that list, that would at least give everybody a heads up on who might be showing up.
Yeah,
okay.
I can work with Sharon and get you guys that. They have not all been assigned, Steve. So this is it. GTT goes out for each site and determines who the secondary provider is going to be for this project. But I definitely can give you what we already have.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
helpful.
Perfect.
Kimberly, you got your hand up?
Thanks, Steve. And I'm not sure if this question would be for Steve or Tracy with the CenturyLink team, but at some point with this improvement portion and this diverse carrier, I would love to know the call flow piece. So for example, if we end up having an issue on the CenturyLink side of call flow and we end up rolling over and using the diverse carrier network, where does that happen? And how does the call flow over into the Comcast side of the network? And if
Yeah.
that network's coming into my back room, and then is there a presence then at the CenturyLink CO? So it would be really interesting if we can have some sort of educational session with you on just that call flow piece. So if we could just maybe put
I
that
don't know
up
if
on
you
the
want to do it
shelf.
now. We
Well,
can work with that.
well,
That's
hold
not
on.
difficult.
Yeah, hold on. So one, let me just be clear. This is going to be transparent to the PSAP. So when a call transitions from Lumen last mile to Comcast last mile, it won't be any impact to the PSAP. There won't be any loss of call. The caller won't even know that the call transitioned to the second provider, because the Cisco routers there is taking care of all of that piece. So I just want to make sure everybody understands that, because we're modernizing the network and adding this last mile provider in there, it doesn't change what happens at the PSAP. And the whole reason behind it is it's transparent at the PSAP. All of these last mile providers have what we call NNIs, network to network interfaces, to the Lumen MPLS backbone. So any calls transitioning from the Lumen last mile to the Comcast last mile is transparent. And like Kevin said, we can put together a network drawing that shows that, but all that magic happens within the Lumen network and within the two separate routers that are at each location that are constantly talking to one another.
Maybe just for some of us that would like a little bit deeper
I
understanding.
can
That
easily do that. And the diagram I would do probably isn't a literal, because if I show you a diagram of what it is, it's not going to help you any. I can actually walk you through, maybe whiteboard it a little bit and show you how the next gen connects to you and answer any questions you have. And because I don't know this is the right forum for that. I didn't prepare for it for one thing.
No,
But
Kevin, I wasn't asking
yeah,
for today. I
okay.
was just asking if we could put
Yeah.
that on the radar for a future discussion. I think it would be helpful for this group to just understand call flow. So that would just
Yeah.
be my ask.
Kimberly,
Not a
can
problem,
we do
Kimberly.
it
And
next-
Steve, this is
Yes.
Rich. Can I give a 20-second overview and then we'll get
Sure.
into more detail? Yeah, there's within the infrastructure and the network configurations, there's really kind of two levels of failover for PSAP. One is a network failover. So our system and our network infrastructure sees what IPs are available through whatever routes are there. So if a call, let's give it one scenario, is call is dropped mid-call, then we can retain that and reroute that traffic over another link available to that PSAP for that destination IP. So that's a network type of failover mid-call. There's also application failover. So we're constantly communicating with those IP addresses. So if we lost an IP on one side, then we were able to
use our applications and reroute calls to a secondary or a backup or a load balanced IP. So from our system, from a perspective, is we see the endpoints, we see multiple paths to get to those endpoints, and we're covered if that call fails either mid-call or if the entire CPE side goes down, we have our alternate routes. But this is just those different network connections are all built into the infrastructure. And if we lose one, but we can still see the destination IP from another network, that call continues and is rerouted over the proper network.
Yeah. Hey, and I appreciate it, Richard. But I think it would be beneficial for Kevin and working with you, Rich, to kind of put together that call flow, that high level network diagram. We don't need to get down into the weeds. So I think every PSAP understands the call flow in the event of a failure. Not that it's gonna impact the PSAP, but at least they know that they truly have, that level of diversity that we talk about all the time in the 911 world. So absolutely, we can provide that, Kimberly. And I think we can, if on the next users group meeting, if we want to allocate 30 minutes for Kevin and Rich to walk through that, we can definitely accommodate that request.
Steve, thank you.
and-
Steve, thank you. I really appreciate that. And it's part of the tariff and it's a service that we're paying for. So I think just showcasing, what we're getting and what we're paying for, so we have
I
a high
want you
level
to know.
understanding. We're not engineers and we don't expect to be engineers, but it's good information. So we know a little bit about that diversity and the resilience of the network. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Rich,
and
we can.
sorry, last comment. And it's something we're proud of. The intelligence and the configuration that we put into the infrastructure is really quite amazing compared to other, the redundancy and diversity built into the configurations. Creating these additional diverse links just adds to it. So the methodology really hasn't changed on how we reach an endpoint, but the physical network is changing, which just makes it that much better. So it's like Kevin said, it's something we like talking about because we're proud of it. So we're happy to do it. We're happy to talk about things that we don't necessarily like or are proud of too, but this absolutely is something we're proud of and look forward to having that discussion.
But we've got a hand up. Jennifer, I'll get you 1 second. I got a quick follow-up question. In the new Frontier, does a PSAP get notified when the network switches from one to the other?
So I'm gonna answer that in 2 ways. If you look at any of the SLAs, it talks about downtime now. In the scenario when a call switches from one network to another, there's no loss of service, so there's no notification. I do believe if that circuit stays out for an extended period of time and you're running on one circuit, we will notify. But I don't think, in general, when a call switches, because it could be a temporary where it could be 20 seconds or 2 minutes. So Tracy, we can kind of look and see what the requirements were, but traditionally, if that circuit goes out, there should be some notification sent that, hey, circuit A is out. And then when it's restored, there should be an email generated that the circuit is now been restored. So we can kind of check and see. The one thing that we have learned is we can bombard customers with emails that they become oblivious to them, where they don't even respond to them because they get so many. So we have to be careful when we say, want to see emails when one circuit goes down, the other one is. So we can provide whatever level of email response that you all want.
Well, maybe if you could just do some research, and then when you do your presentation next in the August meeting, just let us know what notifications are. That would be great.
That'd be fair. That's fair.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I actually wanted to second Steve's suggestion about making phone calls prior to technicians showing up on site. We've had concerns in past years about work being done and technicians showing up at PSAPs without any kind of notification ahead of time. And in these times of heightened security, I think it's appropriate for CenturyLink and any subcontractors that they have to be making phone calls a day or two ahead of time to the PSAP leader to make sure that they know which techs are going to show up on scene and to provide that order number so they know exactly what's being done in their back room.
I don't think that's an unreasonable ask in this day and time. So Tracy, could you take that back and see how we can coordinate that going forward?
Yeah, we can take it back. We have a different team that manages the Lumen techs as well as our contracted ones. So we can take it back to that group.
Absolutely.
Sure.
I have one other quick question. Does the PSAP have any choices when it comes to a provider for that backup and secondary? The reason why I ask is, our property at our PSAP is full of fiber and it obviously connects to many other buildings. Do we have a opportunity to help, number one, choose a secondary provider if that's an option, and number two, choose the path that it's coming in so that we know if Backhoe Bob decides to dig a hole in the wrong place, we have a diverse path physically on our building.
Yeah, let me take that one. So when we put together the pricing for the tariff, we identified second last mile providers that were available, and those were the ones we got prices from. So if we have a situation where, you're PSAP and let's say we know the second last mile provider is going to be GTT, and maybe you had a bad experience with GTT and there's another provider that has interface in and out of the Lumen network, we can definitely discuss those to see if there's any financial impact. The other thing I would tell you is in the design of this diversity and resiliency, there wasn't any consideration for path diversity, only because when we get pricing from an alternate last mile provider, they don't share their network path maps with us. All they share with us is going into a building, they've got a entry point and they've got fiber going into that building. So what I will say, if we have situations where that there's a provider out there that has path diversity, we can definitely have the conversation. But a lot of times we don't know if they're using some shared conduits with Lumen or whoever. We just don't know what we don't know. And the only time we can really guarantee path diversity is if both circuits are Lumen, right? So when we have customers that say, I want path diversity end to end, the only way we can guarantee that is if we Lumen are building the fiber to that location and we know that we're not sharing any resources along the way. So we can definitely have a conversation with that provider. And sometimes I will say, we have seen them say, hey, we will provide you the route map, but 9 times out of 10, they don't want to share that with us. So we have no idea what that path looks like.
Thank you, Steve. You mentioned
right.
have a conversation. If a PSAP wanted to have a conversation with Lumen about any of those things specific to how their building is going to get wired up, who would that be with?
It would start with Tracy, and then Tracy would engage me and Kevin to again. But let me just be clear that path diversity was not included and a part of this network modernization. So anytime you start talking about creating this path diversity, it wasn't part of the plan, and there could potentially be incremental costs because that provider may charge for a new path coming into that building.
That's fair. I just want to make sure that there's a point of contact for that opportunity to have a conversation if that's desired.
Yep. Tracy would be the person, and she would engage Kevin and myself and the Lumen folks to have that conversation. And we have had customers that say, hey, I know path diversity wasn't a part of my requirement, but I want it and I'm willing to pay for it. That's not an issue.
Any more questions for Lumen or Intrado on this? Hearing none. Tracy, do you want to keep going?
Yep, I absolutely do. Line 5, Jennifer, does the summary make better sense now? Just talking about Lumen Phase 1 request compliance?
Hang tight. I'm just reading it over. Yes.
So just for everyone's awareness and my Lumen folks too, this is a meeting where the user group wanted to know kind of the Lumen stance on this. And when we met last time, we didn't deliver the ask. So Jennifer did send a meeting invite. It is August 11th. Everyone on my team should have been included, and there are some agenda items and questions that they're looking to get answered. So this meeting has been scheduled for August 11th. I've spoken to the majority of the Lumen folks, and we are ready to show up and present what we have to you on this topic, and then open it up for questions. So apologize for the miscommunication at the meeting in May, but I think we're ready to step forward and discuss this on August 11th. For the next two items, I do need to turn it over to my buddy Andrew, because he has been working directly with Wesco. And I know he did get some updates this week, but I'm not 100% sure what they are, Andrew, for Wesco, as far as dialable numbers, and then some of the calls with the unusable alley.
Yeah, so for these next two items, I really have taken my time and talked to a lot of different people regarding the dialable numbers. There's so far nothing different from that sheet from the discovery and testing that was done. But just because there was, some things unexpected on there, I just been trying to be really thorough in going through that and making sure I'm talking to all the right people. But there's been no change in the dialable or non-dialable numbers that we found. Nothing's been added, nothing's been taken away. So I'm hoping that this will be wrapped up soon, but I'm still gonna talk to a couple other people and just make sure I'm not missing anything. So hopefully that's done. I did provide a request, I think, for Gunnison had asked for that information and was able to get that. So hopefully that will be wrapped up and off this list soon. David Boss, who's working the tickets for the alley issue, he said that he took a look last week, didn't see anything new, but was taking another deep dive this week. Wesco has continued to provide us information as it's come to them, and we get that to David. So that one's still kind of ongoing, but just no resolution to that. It's just basically a work in progress still.
Thank
But
you.
that's all I've got for those two.
Thank you. Next one is the probe metrics I mentioned that we had a question about May 29th. I've been working with RNOC, our engineers, Intrado. We, keep in mind that this information is kind of a snapshot in time. It's not an ongoing, 24/7 looking at the same thing. So it was difficult for them to go back and pinpoint exact timing. But they got it close to, it was approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on May 29th. And the only thing that they could attribute this to is a firewall issue. There were no alarms at RNOC. We didn't have alarming at Intrado. There was really no impact to the PSAPs. it wasn't call impacting. It didn't end up being voice impacting. If you recall, when I showed it on the screen last May, there wasn't anybody on the phone that had indicated they had a problem on the 29th. So that really is the best that we can tell, is that it was part of a firewall issue that did take place on May 29th. As we saw earlier, it did not happen in June. And I went back to October of last year, and I didn't have any issues with this particular metric where we dropped below the line. They are going to keep an eye on it now. I brought it to their attention that, hey, it happened once. So if it happens again, let's look at it. But I don't know that I can get any more information other than it was tied to a firewall issue. And if you guys have specific questions, I can share with the NAC, but that was the final feedback I got back after talking to several different groups. Are we all okay if we move that to the second tab of closed items? And that way, if it does come up again, we'll have the history. No, I'm
I'd say
going to,
silence is approval
I
there.
was gonna say, I'm gonna assume yes. Like I said, we don't delete it. I just move it to the other tab. So it will always be here if we need to go back. Tariff expectations, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because we do have Steve on from Lumen, and he had an excellent conversation with Grand Junction to try and explain, tariff and different things that might have fees to PSAPs, and he is here today to cover that for everyone else at a high level. And the other items on here are really just quick project status updates that have been requested. I had a kickoff call yesterday with Logan County. That's being managed by our technical project team. So they're just looking at a Viper refresh. And then some of the items on line, I think 12, 13, 14, if you can scroll down a little bit, these are just upcoming PSAP moves. Again, not issues or problems necessarily for this meeting, but just trying to keep everything in one place so that if you guys do have questions, I have the right folks on my side on the call to talk about it. So that is really all we have as far as existing items go. If you guys have anything else that I need to add to this or change, I'm happy to get that taken care of for next week. Otherwise, if it's all right, Stephen, we'll have Steve talk about the possible tariff, the tariff expectations and what may or may not cause an increase in cost to a PSAP.
Before we transition to that, any other questions for Tracy? Kimberly?
I just had a quick question regarding when my circuit was going to get turned up. We have that second circuit installed here from CenturyLink, but it hasn't been turned on. So Jeff, I don't know if you can follow up and look into that for us.
Yes,
Jeff,
we can. Go ahead, Tracy.
I was saying I can do it since you're traveling. I think it's just a matter of getting with Tamika and then Ken at Entrado.
That would be
Right.
great because we have it here.
Okay.
It just, we need that final go live. So it'd be great if we could get that done.
Yeah, let me double check. Tamika's the one on our end that sets up the activation, and then I usually work with Ken. So Kimberly, let me find out. I will respond to you today.
Thanks, Tracy.
Yep.
Carl?
Yeah, should these items like that be moving to closed if they're installed but not operational? Because it sounds like they should be still as a project tracker.
Any thoughts? Another silence.
This is Jennifer. I don't think we should have stuff closed until it's fully complete, but that's just my opinion.
And Jennifer, which line item was that? Sorry.
I'm not talking about any specific item.
Okay.
I think Carl was though.
No, it was the lead a move where I think it's under the closed items.
I can put it
That's
back.
not operational.
Yep, let me, I will move it back. And like I said, I will respond directly to Kimberly today and I'll update this sheet as well.
Thanks, Carl. Any further questions before we transition over to Steve? Nothing heard. Steve?
All right. Here, I'm gonna share my screen. Can somebody promote me so I can share?
Give me just 1 second. I'll work on that.
All righty.
Okay, you should have sharing rights.
All righty. It says host disabled sharing. Host disabled attendee screen sharing, so it won't let me share.
Oh, come on, Zoom. One participant can share at a time. Who can share all participants?
Well, I think, are you
Be
still
able to
sharing?
share.
Somebody, yeah.
Want to try it again?
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Let's see here. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right, let me put it in presentation mode. Let me get this up here. Okay. All right. So first of all, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. So what I wanted to do is kind of lay out. I know we've seen other providers come in state and offer up a cloud-based call handling solution. So I just want to kind of set the stage that when we deployed statewide A911 and next gen core services for the state of Colorado, and we'll send this deck out as well. To the right is kind of the network topology that was designed. And I think the key takeaway on this slide is, there's redundant MPLS circuits going to each location, and the routers are at the Lumen site, and the PSAP equipment was at the customer prem. So when we start talking about next gen for the state of Colorado, years ago, the thought of somebody doing a cloud-based solution was truly in theory. So everything that's in the tariff when it was developed years ago was based on the delivery of the next gen 911 call to an individual PSAP, and that call was processed by that PSAP, or we have seen places where they do a geo-diverse type solution and they have a WAN on the other end, but we still deliver that call to the host controllers. And then, if you did a WAN solution, they would get access to that via the WAN. So, the Lumen responsibility to stop the delivering that call to the 2 routers that we install at the host CPE location. That was the initial premise and design of the state of Colorado next generation hour network. And for years, this was the typical design from a next gen perspective. So I just wanted to put this slide up here to kind of create a reference point of what the current deployment architecture looks like. Any questions? All right. So, and by having that solution that I just described, when PSAPs wanted to do an on-site update, so let's say their equipment is 5 years old and then they're migrating from software version X to vendor A software version Y, we're still using that same infrastructure, and the CPE vendor would coordinate with Lumen to say, hey, can we move this circuit over for testing? Can we put it back? Can we do stuff, but it was still utilizing that existing Lumen MPLS infrastructure that was in place. And when we're doing on-site hardware refreshes or even replacement, we utilize the existing network infrastructure. And by doing that, that required little to no lumen involvement. And in that scenario, there would be no Intrado project or technical services required because, we would notify them that, hey, we need to take circuit A out of their rotation to do testing, put it back. So, those are normal services that are provided as part of our NOC offering. And requires minor lumen project management, and the only project management that we do is the coordination with our NOC that, hey, there's a vendor out there doing a hardware refresh or changing from vendor A hardware to vendor B, but still utilizing the same lumen infrastructure. It's just a matter of us notifying our NOC that this type work is going on. So when we get an alarm that circuit A is down, we know exactly what's going on. This has kind of been the model for most customers for years. Let me stop and pause. Any questions or comments? All right, perfect. So what we saw happen with the first customer, Jeffcom, was this now change in the dynamic of the call routing. So in this diagram here, you can see the number one, we Lumen are still delivering that traffic to the two Lumen routers that are at each PSAP. And because the Carbine solution is in the cloud, what they chose to do is something called hairpin, which what they've asked us to do is go to that existing router and configure additional ports on that router, keeping the 911 traffic on, let's say, port A on router A and port B on router number 2, to configure a port on router 1 for Carbine hairpin traffic and configure a port on router 2 for Carbine hairpin traffic. So what we learned from the Jeffcom is, so we go in there, we program those ports on those routers, on those existing Lumen routers. That traffic hairpins, and the reason we use the term hairpin, we deliver the call to the Lumen router, and then the ports that are configured for the Carbine solution, that traffic now takes the route to the customer provided or Carbine provided network for the hairpin to go to number 2, which is, this is the hairpin scenario, which is the Carbine interface. That could be customer provided network or Carbine provided network, to get that call to the Carbine cloud call handling. And then it turns around and sends that call back to the PSAP to be answered by Carbine call taking equipment. So you can see that call basically does a hairpin. We deliver it Lumen to the number 1, our routers there. And then Carbine takes that traffic and hairpins it to the cloud back to the PSAP. And I think what we've uncovered with the Jeffcom solution is there's a lot of coordination, testing, configuration that needs to happen prior to that customer going live on the Carbine solution. What I think doesn't get communicated in that Carbine discussion is this round robin solution, and then the required work that Lumen and Intrado has to do to accommodate this solution, which is outside of the original intent of the tariff. Let me stop and pause to see if there's any questions thus far. All right, perfect.
Hold on, I
And-
think Andrew Dameron has his hand up.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I can't
Yeah.
see the hand. So
Yeah. Hey, Steve.
Okay.
So you stated that you kind of, and I don't know if this was intentional or not. You made it sound like the hairpin was a decision made by Carbine, and the version of events that we got from them was that the hairpin is required only because we don't have an I3 compliant ESInet. That if we had core services in place, the hairpin would no longer be required. Does that jive with your understanding as well?
Absolutely not. Is Rich still on the call?
I am.
Rich Shaw. Yeah. So Rich, I'm gonna let you take down because we had this conversation with Carbine about building an infrastructure to the A911. So do you mind taking that one since I know we had this conversation with them?
Sure. Yeah, it doesn't, I mean, from a high level, the hairpin, there's no causality between that and I3 at all. The reason for that is because the current network terminates at the PSAP location. Because Carbine needs to get it back up to their cloud location, they need to take it from there and bring it to their cloud location. That'd be true if it was what we're doing right now, which is transitional SIP or I3 or anything. Because those current terminations are at the PSAP location, the only way for Carbine to take in that call and process it and send it to the call taking positions is for them to hairpin it from where our DMARC is, which is the PSAP, to their cloud and back again. Does that make sense?
Hey, this is Jeremy with Grand Junction. I want to add to that though. The i3 document since version 1 has specified cloud native services and solutions on that. And I think there's a very big differentiation between the i3 document as it stands from Nina and what is being presented by Lumen in this tariff and process itself. So kind of back to Andrew's comments, I think that Lumen is taking a very, I want to say, narrow approach, and for lack of a better term, but if we're building this based off of an i3 document with the goal and intent of getting to true i3, it's not fair to say that information or that the cloud native services have not been offered in that document. As even as recent as version 3, they get into full cloud native services. So it's been presented in that document.
And I don't think we're disagreeing that we can't use a cloud native solution or anything like that. It's how the network is terminated today, which is, and Steve, keep me honest, is defined in the tariff. That is a local termination to the PSAP. So because that termination is local to the PSAP, the only way Carbine can get it to their cloud is to, once we hand it off, Lumen Mantrado hand it off at the PSAP location, the only way to get it to the cloud is through this hairpin.
So is what I'm hearing then that the tariff language is not I3 compliant then based on the most recent documentation?
Well, no, so that's not what Rich is saying. So we did have some conversation with Carbine as it related to JeffCom to build for Carbine to build an infrastructure to a Intrado SBC. So we're doing SBC to SBC communication. And then you wouldn't need the hairpin scenario, but you would still need to get a network back to the PSAP. And Rich, I think we started down that route with them, and they didn't choose to deploy that model, and that's why we did the hairpin, because that was going to be incremental cost for them to build an infrastructure to the A911 point of interface for that traffic handoff. So I just want to be clear, in the tariff, the language in the tariff was to deliver the calls to the individual PSAP, which is what we're doing. Carbine, the cloud call vendors, the hairpin scenario is in place so they can reuse the existing infrastructure for that call delivery. But there's nothing stopping cloud call handling providers from building an infrastructure directly to an A911 SBC, which would eliminate this hairpin. Rich, did I say that correctly? Because I know we had this conversation with Carbine.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Where the I3 thing may come into effect is that RFA, the current solution requires an alley query too. And I think, again, I'm trying to remember back, this is years now, that at that time, Carbine couldn't do an RFAI solution, couldn't do a transitional solution with alley. So maybe that had something to do with having it local as well. I just know that, it's a capability of our system, like Steve said, to speak directly from the A911 infrastructure to the Carbine cloud infrastructure. We just need circuits to get out there. Yeah, so it wouldn't be a limitation on our side.
So
That's
from
correct.
and I think from the I3 document, I guess there's some differences opinions there. But I guess from Andrew and a junction perspective, if they were to move those ESInet hosts then, as you're stating, those routers into the Intrado Lumen hosting solutions, either Miami or Longmont, for that call delivery, is that what you're speccing that would get around this interpretation?
I
And I apologize to get technical, guys, but I feel like that we're putting our we're being held now kind of hostage to a situation based off of the Lumen's interpretation of and build out based off of that tariff, that as these phone providers are all going to cloud-based, this is something we're all going to have to address in the next handful of years. And so we need to kind of lay the foundation of this.
So, Steve, I mean, I can talk about it from a technical perspective, that if there were network paths from the A911 ESInet, the Colorado A911 ESInet to Carbine's cloud-based solution, then we could send them these calls directly without a hairpin. Why that's not happening, I think there's why that didn't happen for Jeffco. I think there were a bunch of reasons, and it was years ago, so I don't know. I know that one of the issues was that it is not I3 in Colorado right now. I3 is not on the tariff in Colorado right now, so we have a transitional SIP solution that requires an alley query. So that may have been some of the reasons why they needed to keep it local, but there's no restriction from a technical perspective of setting up connectivity between our A911 infrastructure and a cloud host directly.
Yeah. Hey, and let me add to that. We did have that conversation with Carbine for Jeffcom, and what happened was there was going to be incremental costs for that network infrastructure from the Carbine cloud to the A91 infrastructure, and it wasn't accounted for. So I just want to be clear, Lumen is not dictating this hairpin scenario. What we're saying is because Carbine hasn't built an infrastructure to Intrado, number one, and number two, the state is still on RFAI, not I3. The only way to accommodate this scenario, which is to do this hairpin, and keep in mind that was a request of Carbine. Carbine requested of Lumen to configure additional ports on the routers for Jeffcom so that traffic could be hairpin. Lumen did not say to Carbine that you've got to do it this way, you got to do the hairpin. That was not the discussion. We said today the MPLS circuits terminate at the customer prim to those two routers, and you all tell us what your deployment plan is. And they're the ones that came back and said, configure additional ports on the routers for this hairpin. That was not a Lumen design saying this is how you have to do it.
Yeah, and Steve, at least in my experience with them, they didn't place the onus on Lumen as requiring that specific solution. It was kind of communicated as a creative solution that they came up with because of the deficiencies in the current structure of the ESInet. So it sounds like the hairpin was according to Lumen, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the hairpin was the cheap option. There is an option that could remove the hairpin, but it would incur cost for Carbine to establish.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, like I said, this hairpin was a Carbine design, not a Lumen design. We're delivering that traffic to those routers at the PSAP customer edge. And because there isn't an infrastructure in place between the Carbine Cloud and Entrado A911, this was their design. So there was no dictation by Lumen or Entrado saying this is how you got to do it. So I just want to be clear that we didn't say to anybody that this is how you have to deploy this Carbine.
So Steve, I have a question. This is Jennifer.
Yes, ma'am.
Is this design going to be required for Grand Junction's implementation and Denver's implementation?
If there isn't an infrastructure put in place by Carbine to the Entrado A911 infrastructure, yes, it will be required. That is the only way you can get that call from the PSAP to the Carbine Cloud to be delivered back to the PSAP is this hairpin scenario until Carbine or the state builds an infrastructure to the A911 from the Carbine Cloud.
And then the next question I have is, has anybody either from Lumen or from Grand Junction or Denver or other entities implementing Carbine, have you guys had any conversations with Carbine about their ability and timeline to build that connection or intention?
Hey, Jennifer, it's Ryan here in Junction. And Steve, yeah, I don't want to drag too much of this conversation specific to what we're trying to do here, because we've obviously had a lot of back and forth with Lumen on this. But I will say that I still think there's some misunderstanding around what options are at this point. Because after we met with you guys, we immediately followed up with Carbine. And what they were telling us is Jeffcom was a custom build out for them. Jeffcom had some existing architecture they wanted to use. I'm not familiar with it, so I'm not sure I could really describe it gracefully. But however, Jeffcom was trying to do something was very unique to them, which is not something we're doing. And so Carbine is still convinced that the amount of effort in this hairpin architecture, at least for what we're trying to do out here, is not going to be needed. So I'll just say there's still some communication that I think needs to happen between everybody that's involved, at least with our project, with Lumen, with Carbine, and obviously with us, to make sure we understand what we're all trying to do here. So
yeah, so let me say this, and I can say that I don't know how Carbine can say what needs to happen on the Entrado side, because what I will tell you is what we put in place for Jeffcom is exactly what they're asking us to do for Grand Junction. From my conversations with them on the initial call, there's only one way to do this hairpin, and it's exactly what we did for Jeffcom. So for them to state that Jeffcom was a custom design, it may be because they had some network infrastructure already in place to get from Grand Junction to the cloud and back to the PSAP. You know, that creates more of a conversation, because once we deliver the call to, let's say, for Grand Junction, how does that call get from the Grand Junction PSAP to the Carbine Cloud back to Grand Junction? And let me just say this, we Lumen and Entrado, we've not had any conversations with Carbine about Grand Junction other than it's similar to what we did in Jeffcom. So we've not had any call flow discussions, which we don't get involved in those, because our DMARC right now is to deliver that call to those two routers at the customer location. And from a FCC reporting and outage perspective, you know, once we deliver the calls to those routers and we see that we deliver those calls and the circuits are up, then if something happens in this hairpin scenario, from an outage perspective, we have no visibility, and we don't know that that call didn't get delivered back to the PSAP once it left the Lumen routers. That's why, as a part of our proposal to the customer, there's a waiver in there that the PCEP has to sign that basically says, hey, during this testing period, we're not on the hook if something goes haywire because they flooded that router with test calls or something. So that's the reason for that. And I just want to be clear once again, this is not a Lumen design. We've not dictated this to anybody. What we've said is, if you want to do this hairpin scenario, there's work, project management, technical project management, program management, testing, configuration that's required by Intrado and Lumen to fulfill that request for a carbine hairpin solution.
So Steve, let me ask this, and maybe this is a question I think I can ask. If Carbine reapproached Lumen with Grand Junction and said, hey, we want to reinvestigate getting direct connectivity to our cloud from the A911 infrastructure, I think Lumen's open to that conversation, right? The outstanding question is, there's new network and there's costs around that, and someone has to cover the costs from the A911 infrastructure to the Carbine cloud. But from a technical perspective, is Lumen open to having that discussion?
And we absolutely are, and we shared that with Carbine during the GFCOM deployment. So
Okay.
it's never been that this is how you have to do it, Carbine. What the Lumen story has been currently based on what's in place today. We deliver the call to those routers per the tariff, and then from those routers that becomes a demarc, and this whole hairpin is a Carbine design, not a Lumen design.
This is Kevin. I got one thing to add. I think if we're not, I'm personally not against having any type of arrangement, but I just want to make sure it complies with the tariff. And so if we start doing direct connects to cloud providers, I mean, my simple low hanging fruit is, how do I do probes? And how do I measure all the test measure? And I know there's possibly ways to do it, but we just gotta make sure it's accommodated.
Yeah. So let me just say, we can definitely accommodate that piece. That's not an issue. That's a moot point. I think it's the onus is on Carbine and the state if they want to build that infrastructure to the A911 points of interface. Absolutely, Lumen isn't opposed to that. Never has been, never will be.
So this is Jeremy, Pickens County. I think we need to expand this beyond just Carbine and the current architecture of what's going on. Intrado is selling their Viper as a cloud solution. Motorola is now selling the Vesta as a cloud solution. So these products are coming, and we need to sit down and, as a state, figure out how we're going to process this in this current Lumen infrastructure. And it seems to me direct connections are probably the best product, but we need to figure out how we move forward with that. I know we have challenges based off of current implementations, but this is the way things are going. And so we've got to come up with a solution for this.
Hey, and I think great point. And so Tracy, I think what we should do is start having a conversation, loop Tim Kunkelman in, because keep in mind, once you open up that box, that door, so there's got to be an infrastructure built for, let's say, Carbine. There's got to be an infrastructure built for Motorola. There's got to be an infrastructure built for any of the other ones, Illyrium, who is then their Comtech. So we should definitely engage in a conversation with Tim Kunkelman to see if this is an amendment we want to make to the existing tariff to accommodate these direct connection interfaces. Tracy, let's take that one, have that conversation with Tim. So, I mean, we're definitely not opposed to that at all. So yeah, absolutely, we can do that. Because you're right. I mean, with the future, cloud is where we're heading. So I think we need to address it in some amended and updated language in the tariff to accommodate that request for this cloud providers.
Steve, we've got a couple more questions. I think,
Okay.
Jennifer, if you could, you're up. Actually, Kimberly is up next, and then we'll have to add something to the agenda for the next meeting so we can check back
Okay.
in on that conversation, because I think the future is on us. It's not the future, it's now. So,
Yep.
Kimberly, what you got?
Yeah, that was a great point of future-proof the language and the tariff for this technology and the changes. But I also think part of the question that we started this conversation off with was how the tariff matches up with the project management fees and where that can align with. And can Lumen charge project management fees for CPE changes? And I
Yeah.
think we need some answers to that and how those can be applied, because is it project management fees for CPE changes for cloud-based complicated deployments? And does the tariff allow that discretion on complicated CPE changes? Is it all CPE changes? So I think we need some understanding around that, and maybe a PUC opinion on that, or some dialogue, so we know what to expect when we're
Yeah.
doing upgrades on our CPEs.
Perfect. So I will send this deck out as well. So in this deck, we actually went to the Colorado A911, the Colorado Next Gen tariff. And there's in this 9.2-4, there's a statement that says, if services other than those listed in this tariff are requested, the company reserves the right to charge the BS customer for that service. In any instance where individual case basis charges apply, an estimate of charges are negotiated, and negotiated completion dates will be provided to the BS customer. So what we did is we went to the tariff, and it clearly states anything that's not listed in the tariff is an ICB charge. And so we went to the tariff and pulled out what items are considered in the tariff. And it's the next generation ESInet, and then the ECATs, the wireless module. So the tariff, and we had a conversation with Tim Kunkelman about this as well, is that this isn't a CPE change. This is more of a network redesign, that is considered an ICB because that wasn't considered in the initial development of the tariff. And then what we also did is we got with Intrado, and for these carbine site deployments, or anybody that uses this hairpin scenario, there's technical project management time that's required. There's voice engineering time that's required. There's network engineering. There's system admin hours. There's install hours. So this is from an Intrado perspective, whenever we have to make a change to the customer end to accommodate this hairpin scenario, these are the functions that Intrado has to engage resources to complete. And then from a Lumen perspective, if it's just a plain Jane simple, we're upgrading our CPE, or we're getting a new CPE provider, there hasn't been any Lumen project management charges, because that's a matter of coordinating with the NOC to notify them that the circuit's being taken out of service. So we don't have to get involved and do any coordination of sort. And I was sending this out, and this is kind of what, in this carbine or cloud-based role, the Lumen project program manager is involved a lot more in the planning, in the creation of the communication plan. They work with the vendor for the cutover plan, the implementation, the cutover and transition, and project closure. So there's a lot more work when you're doing this hairpin scenario that a Lumen project program manager has to do in order to implement that solution. And then secondly, inside of the Lumen tariff for the state of Colorado, there's a line item in there for Lumen ESInet project management. And it clearly states in the tariff that the project management fees apply only with respect to the initial provisioning of the ESInet service to a PSAP. So, you know, from an initial deployment, Lumen project management services was included in there. So anytime we're being asked to do things outside of what the initial tariff deployment model was, we have the right per the tariff to charge for project management fees. And then there was another line item in the tariff that says, in no case will the Lumen project management fee exceed 10 hours per concurrent call session. So everything that we've been talking about and charging for this Grand Junction and the other projects, and even, you know, if we go back to JeffCom, it is identified in the tariff that those are billable line items per Tim Kunkelman.
Jennifer, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just had, sorry, I have to go back and remember what my question was. My original question was if the state moves toward I3 architecture for the entire ESInet, is it still required to create individual connections for Carbine, Vesta, and so on and so forth?
Yes, you still got to get the call. If you wanted to do a direct connection, that means when we get the 911 call at the A911 infrastructure, instead of sending it down the Lumen MPLS path to the customer PSAP, we send that call over to Carbine Cloud to be delivered to the PSAP.
It
So
just seems
you,
really inefficient for a statewide ESInet to have different connections for different call handling solutions. Is this how
well,
it's being done in other states with multiple
absolutely.
call handling?
Absolutely. We was involved in the whole California CalOS, and keep in mind, there's not been a state that has said, hey, we're paying for the direct connections. Normally what we've seen is when that vendor is proposing their solution to a customer, either they're going to eat the cost of that direct connection because it's going to be shared by anybody else that's using that particular vendor CPE in other states. They will use that same infrastructure. So it's not one that, hey, I got to create from Carbine, I build to Entrado. Now that's only going to be used for Carbine, Colorado. They're going to use that same infrastructure for anywhere in the state that's a PSAP is on A911 and want to go to the Carbine Cloud. So it isn't a one for one per state. When that vendor, cloud call handling vendor, builds that infrastructure to Motorola, Comtech, Entrado, Lumen, they're using that connection for anybody in any state that's using that NGCS provider. And that is the industry standard.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. And the
Sure.
other thing I just wanted to add to the conversation, because I see that I think you have one more slide left, but I think it's a question slide. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the PUC is looking at this question of project management services with regards to connecting different types of call handling equipment to the ESInet. And I can't say any more than that, but it is something that we are looking at.
Absolutely. Okay, perfect. And we'll send this deck out. We'll get Tracy to send it out. But, you know, we spent a lot of time with Tim Kunkelman looking at the tariff to make sure, because, you know, and I will say this, being totally transparent, when we did the JeffCom solution and Rich is on, it took Entrado working directly with Carbine over 130 hours of testing, configuration, testing meetings to get come up. Rich, did I say that correctly?
Yep. Yep.
So
Sorry, I was up you. Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, there was I would say, yeah, it was the first time we were doing that kind of thing. So, network configurations, a lot of back and forth, testing, turn up, verification, all that stuff. But yes, it was over 130 hours of our project management, our engineering time, all that stuff.
yeah, and I think the piece I have a lot of heartburn with is when a vendor says, hey, it shouldn't take somebody X amount of time to do something, because we would never say that about what it would take them to do something on their side, because we don't know what's involved. And what we what we've also done, we've had a conversation, and here's how the process works, being totally transparent. When a new agency comes to us and say, hey, we want to use the carbine solution with the hairpin scenario, that that's how they interface with the carbine, we go to our vendor partner Intrado and say, hey, give us a rough estimate of magnitude of what you all think it's going to take from an hours to complete that project. They give us a rough estimate of hours, and what we do is we Lumen take those hours, and we then provide the customer a price, and we then assume the risk that if it takes more than the hours that Intrado proposed to us, that we eat it. If it takes less, then we benefit because we're taking that risk. One of the things that we offered up to Grand Junction in our discussion with them a week or so ago is we're fine with billing an entity for the actual number of hours, because we do have an hourly rate for Intrado A911 project management services and Lumen project management service, and that we're okay with saying, hey, here's the rough estimate of hours that Intrado has provided. We can put together our document or contract based on that rough estimate of a not to exceed, and we'll bill you for the actual hours. But if doing that process with the vendor, if it takes more than those budgeted hours that we discuss, then the overages is a responsibility of the PSAP. And so, I mean, we're all open to that type of model. So we're billing you for the actual hours. So if they quoted us like 90 hours and it actually took 40, then we only bill for 40. But if they quote 90 and it takes 150, then we bill for the 150. And I think that's what we put on the table to Grand Junction.
Joe Bankert, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just the idea of a tariff is that it will and can be amended and adjusted over time as technology changes. And, and the idea also of a tariff is that it's supposed to provide non-discriminatory rates and service to all of the customers. And there may be some dislocations or delays or things as technology progresses, because it won't progress for everyone at the same pace. But this may be something we need to look at going forward, what changes are needed in the tariff due to changes in technology and the way services are being used.
Absolutely reasonable. I think what we're going to do is we're going to get a call with Tim Kunkelman to start that process on our side to see, because listen, let's just be honest and transparent. I think in the next 3 to 5 years, a large majority of the country will be on some type of cloud-based solution, right? It's more cost effective. Not having to deal with these hardware refreshes. So I do think that is the future. And I absolutely think we should start having that conversation now. How do we position the state of Colorado so when the Carbines of the world or the Motorola's of the world, that we're not kind of locked into a non-traditional solution, that we get back to an industry standard solution, so that as we go forward and other PSAP decide to go away from an on-prem solution, we can have a fixed cost for that deployment. Absolutely something we're going to start talking about right after this call.
All right, sounds good, Steve. Thanks for the
All right.
presentation, and thanks for the questions. Obviously, this generated many more questions. I just want to do a time check. We only have 3 more minutes. Per Jennifer's comment, it sounds like the PUC is having conversations about that topic. If we can just add this to the agenda for the August meeting to do a check-in, and we'll expect to hear from, maybe Tim himself can come and give his perspective, so we can get some follow-up on that issue. Going back to the agenda, FCC report and order meeting, it was already mentioned during the issue tracker conversation, but on August 11th at 11 a.m. Lumen and Entrada will be doing a presentation, a reset on the message about next gen 911 readiness and roadmap. Any public comment?
Steve, you're still showing your screen.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to stop. Oh, there we go, right near the bottom. How about that? Is it gone away there?
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Any public comment? Hearing none, I have a real quick, not on the agenda follow-up. I had mentioned last time that Boulder County was dealing with erroneous Apple SOS calls. We've been directly in touch with a gentleman by the name of Trey at Apple. There's also an AppGo post on a forum related to the same thing, where PSAP is getting an erroneous Apple message through SOS, through satellite. Since the last meeting, we're now at the total of 6 different erroneous calls. So just want to put it out there that if your PSAPs or your authorities PSAPs have the same issues, Apple's collecting this data. I've got the whole list of the parameters that they're looking for. We've been able to reach out to almost all of the people's phones that made these erroneous texts, and had conversations and get to gather information. So if you have more information on that, if you've had that experience, please holler at me offline and we can get that information to Apple. Anything else from the group? All right, hearing none, we'll see everybody in August. Have a great rest of July and stay cool.
Oh, I have one thing. It's Matt Gage's birthday. Happy birthday, Matt.
Happy birthday, Matt.
Happy birthday, Matt.
Have a great day, everybody.
All right, have a great day.